Mankind has always had a deep-rooted respect for the ocean. At times, we've feared it. At times, we've worshipped it. But the respect has always been there. The ocean is the last great frontier on Earth we've yet to conquer, and the menagerie of fantastic creatures that dwell down in the depths of the sea are still a mystery to us. A mystery that has inspired writers for centuries. Homer, Melville, Verne, Lovecraft. So many authors have written about the weird, powerful, and terrifying beasts that live beneath the ocean's surface. Now, all of these stories were, of course, just works of fiction. After all, nobody believes sea monsters exist. No one actually thinks that the great old ones are asleep somewhere down there in the deepest, darkest trenches of the sea. It's all just fiction. And thank God for that. Because if those stories were real, then the ocean would suddenly be a much scarier place. Fiction. It's all just fiction. No way to say for sure what's really down there, swimming at the bottom of the deep blue abyss. Maybe nothing. Or maybe something far, far worse than what any writer has ever dreamed up before. Strange things happen when the clock strikes 12.
Upon my soul, she was a lovely thing. Pale skin, dark hair entwined with the green weeds of the sea. A pity she looked dead. We hauled her up in the tuna nets along with the dolphin heads and fins. Those warm-blooded bastards would trail the fishing fleets and try to steal our catch when they could. Cunning they were too, but the dead ones not as smart as they might be, since the razor's edges of our nets would slice them up if they weren't quick enough. But she was whole, I saw. As we laid her on the deck, perhaps she'd fallen from some rich man's pleasure vessel in a drinking perry out at sea. No whore more likely than not, and naked she was, as on her born day. But as I leaned over to touch the blue-tipped breasts, I was surprised to feel her move beneath my hand. "Hi, Cat! She's not altogether dead, I think." The others came closer then to take a look. Those turquoise lips, they parted in a gasp, and she opened her eyes as red as blood. Of a sudden, she sprang up and dashed across the deck. She crouched amongst some of the boxes there, and we could see she wasn't no human girl at all. How lithe she was, how lean. Her lips drew back to show her teeth, small, white, and sharp, like a barracuda's, moisture beading, shining on her face and arms. The muscles in her thighs were taut, but stretched deep by our razor's nets. Her breasts were large and pointed. Her fingers and toes were wet. Rainbow-colored scales speckled her body in places, growing over her skin like the heavenly sores of some angelic leper. She was an apparition of a soldier's blackest, sweetest dreams. Anthony, our ship's first mate, was the first to break the trance induced by them round red eyes. Cautiously, he gazed about as he forced himself to venture closer to the thing we'd just caught by chance. Anthony was the most respected sailor on our boat, a Scot, tall, red, broad at the shoulders, who had once served in the Queen's Navy. The monster girl was silent as she eyed him from her fortress nest of boxes. Then she made some sound down in her throat. A seal or dolphin maybe, like was how it rang inside my ears. The Cap clutched his brother's arm and shook his sister's son and roused the rest of us to awakening. The shock of first finding her then dipped away like spin adrift against a boar's hull. Now was all just curious as hell, and Anthony was standing closest to the girl. He took another step and held his hands out so that to let her get the scent of him by way of introduction. She didn't seem to take too much to that, because soon as he was near enough, she bit off a piece of his finger. "Aye, you dumb animal!" Anthony hollered and waved his damaged finger in the air. It was bleeding horribly. He pulled a kerchief from his pocket and wrapped it tight round the tip of it. "Ah, you need to be afraid, gal," he called out. Anthony was a godly man and wouldn't curse the devil himself. "I did not intend to harm you." The rest of us set up a general roar, but the mate said, "Quiet down, you fools, or else you'll frighten the girl or fish or whatever this thing is, and you wouldn't be wanting to scare a wild animal when it's cornered and hurting, and a female to boot." "Aye," the captain agreed in a soft voice, parroting Anthony as was his wont. "And I'm betting if she's scared enough to dash for it, she's primed and able to tear the insides out of anyone that got in her way." That's when some sailor said he feared she'd slaughter us all. "Kill her, Cap!" cried another, "before she comes at us with that shark-toothed mouth of hers." Then Anthony, who had the most reason to wish her harm, raised up his bandaged hand and bade us to relent. "You gents are being hasty here," he said in a peaceful voice. "Mayhap she's not so vicious as we might suppose." And he hid his bloody hand behind his back. "Mayhap she's a gentle thing when she's at home beneath the sea." "Aye," the captain interrupted. A gleam came to his eye. "She's not a monster come into our midst, lad, but a treasure, rare and beautiful she is too. A valuable oddity, a priceless curiosity. Boys, we could peddle her in any port for coins enough to last us years to come." He put his arms around the shoulders of the men closest to him and went on. "Fellow sailors, brothers, merchants, relatives and friends, if we handle this thing correctly here, we'll all come out as rich as kings." And then the eyes of all of us glistened with the golden light. The captain had hit upon the thought that each of us had been afraid to see. A treasure trove, indeed, she was. But what to do? How to proceed? Once caught, how did you keep such a ken of the sea? It was my thought, then, to give her tuna. Why else would she pursue the nets? A poor dumb thing I thought her to be. Human in form mayhap she was, but without a soul. She were no more than a beast. And beasts were such that man were commanded to rule in those first days of creation of the world. She wouldn't have taken the tuna from the deck where I'd tossed it. But she took it soon enough from the bleeding hand of Anthony. And then she made her noise again. A light struck up across the first mate's face. "I hear her, brothers. She speaks the Queen's English." But seeing that we did not hear nor understand the words of the female gave him pause. "But it's as plain as milk," he offered towards the Cap. "As clear as me mother's words when I sat upon her knee." "Aye, you daft man," the captain inquired. "You say there's words inside them chirps and whistles." Anthony turned around, gazing wide-eyed at the creature as she went on with those noises, those blood-red eyes of hers staring back at him just the same. "She says it's me blood that's done it. The bit of flesh that she consumed." He turned to look at the captain. "She says that's why I can hear her in my head." He pulled the rag from his torn finger, and we could see the white tip of the bone as he dripped his own blood onto a piece of tuna in his hand. The girl thing sparkled her bloodshot eyes at him, but reached for his injured digit instead of the fish. Gently, slowly, she seemed to move as she raised the bloodied finger to her lips and nibbled at the damaged flesh. "Have you gone mad?" cried the captain. "Feeding yourself to the sea beast!" The creature pulled Anthony's finger away, which now had only gnarled halfway to the second knuckle, from her mouth and began to yammer on once more. We stood in awe while he nodded his head, as if he understood her yips and yaps. "She be trying to get back to her home, gents," he said with certainty. "And where would that be?" laughed the captain. "1,000 leagues below the ocean's surface." "Nay, it'd be off the coast of an isle about a week's sail west of here," Anthony replied. "She told me so herself. She said she was making her way home when our nets snatched her up. This jewel of the ocean be royalty, Captain. Her king rules the sea, and she, his favorite wife. You saying this thing, this fish woman, this web-toed female, be Neptune's fancy?" asked the captain. But Anthony kept right along, as if he hadn't heard him. "Our nets have done too much harm to her legs," and he gestured towards the gashes running up and down the merwoman's thighs. "Now she's asking for our help. Her kingdom's built of gold and pearls and precious rubies, and she swore to me, on the sanctity of her husband's throne, that if we return her home, that we'd be paid in all the priceless gemstones this barge can haul." "Aye," responded the captain. "Why be as rich as kings, when we can be as wealthy as gods?" There was a low rumble from the crew when he said that. Visions of golden underwater towers jutted up from the ocean's rocky floor and danced and twirled through our heads like barmaids in a tavern when the grog is flowing heavy and the music be merry and the drunks be clapping along and encouraging them. Bah! From amidst the crowd arose a voice, hoarse and graveled it was, that broke us from our fantasies. It was Old Man Job, a half-blind, half-drunk scoundrel that had joined our crew about 3 years prior. Job wasn't much use for sailing, and he wasn't much use for whaling or fishing either. But the captain kept him round because he mopped the decks and cleaned the heads for a bottle of rum, a place to sleep at night, and a little bit of food to go in his belly. When he wasn't out at sea, Job slept under the stars and begged for his meals. I'd have felt sorry for the old vagabond if it wasn't for his nasty demeanor, cold and hostile, callous from years of living in a gutter with rats. Couple that with the fact that he'd been caught a number of times stealing from the crew, and you could see why I thought so little of the wretched bastard. Truth be told, none of us cared for him. But we tolerated old Job, because he took on the duties nobody wanted. Every sailor on the ship then turned his head towards the elderly old man. He was sneering at the girl, still crouching amidst the stacks of crates, a trail of Anthony's blood trickling from her turquoise lips. "A fool's errand ye be suggesting, Anthony," he said. He snorted a little, like a pig, then spat a thick wad of phlegm from his mouth. It landed at the first mate's feet, and a bit of it caught the toe of his boot. "And a dangerous one at that. We haven't the rations for such a voyage, and what if sails rovers? Have you not considered such a thing? We can restock off the coast of Portugal," Anthony replied. "From there our destination's only 3 or 4 days out, depending on the wind," and he once again began to bandage his bloody finger. "As for the pirates, my vote is that the risk is worth the reward." Job pulled a flask from his coat and took a swig, then fired an eye at the fish girl so sharp it could have pierced her the scaly skin. "I don't like the thing, Captain," he said, his voice grinding like a stone pedestal being put to work. "It's an abomination of God. We shouldn't be trusting it." Then the captain's voice erupted into fire. "Shut your vile trap, old man," he shouted. "Did you forget your place on my ship? Next time you think to instruct me on anything, I'll suggest you bite your tongue, lest I'll be cutting it out with the blade I keep on my boot." Anthony set course for the port of Libsyn, so we can restock. Friends and brothers, I aim to get rich. In a week's time, we'll never be needing to pluck another fish from the briny blue again. And with that, we raised the mainsail and changed course, setting off west towards our dream of wealth and fortune. Morale was high amongst the crew 3 days into our voyage. The men sang shanties about mermaids and treasure when we were working, and when we weren't, they talked of the extravagant things they aimed to purchase with their share of the loot. You could feel a buzz throughout the ship as every sailor was excited to see what a treasure lay at the end of our journey. Every sailor except Job, that is. He hadn't spouted off since the captain had put him in his place, but I could see, even with me bad eye, that the old man's heart had yet to thaw when it came to the web-toed female. Anthony, on the other hand, had grown as close as heat to a flame with the girl. She was moved to the first mate's private quarters, away from the curious eye of the men in our vessel. The door was kept closed for privacy, but remained unlocked as per the captain's orders. Periodically, Cap would send a sailor down to check on him, just to make sure the Scot and the fish girl weren't engaging in the perverse, ungodly acts on board his ship. But as I said before, Anthony was a man of the book, and I had my doubts that a deviant thought ever crossed his mind. That isn't to say our first mate wasn't acting strange round the girl, though. He took to feeding pieces of himself to her nightly, and I had the dubious honor of assisting him on those first couple evenings when the captain had ordered me to pay them a visit. First, Anthony would instruct me to fetch a tuna from the deck, a big one. As it turned out, the girl had an appetite on par with that of a horse. When I returned, he would unsheathe the knife he wore on his belt and roll the sleeve of his shirt up round his elbow. Much to the displeasure of my eyes, Anthony would then dig the blade's edge into his forearm and carve free small slivers of flesh. Inside the mouth of the tuna is where he'd place the lump of skin and muscle so that she could eat it with her supper. She devoured her fish raw, like I hear the heathens of the Orient do. Head, bone, and tail, all with the bits of Anthony's flesh inside. I'd watch her eat it while I helped him dress his wound. The smacking of her lips as she savored the uncooked tuna in her mouth was difficult on my ears. Every bite accompanied by an abundance of nauseating noises, slurping and sucking sounds would fill the first mate's cabin while she licked the poor dead fish's eyes and grinded its bone between her pointed teeth. A gruesome sight indeed. But I came to reason that Anthony was letting the she-thing consume him for a purpose. It was explained to me through my discussion with the first mate, however, limited they may be, that over the course of each day, Anthony lost the ability to understand the girl's tongue. Only when his flesh was inside the merwoman's stomach could he make heads or tails of her high-pitched whistles. And how clever of him it was, I did believe, to continue their discussions and gain her trust, as to ensure she did not go back against her words. I was glad that it was he and not I that bonded with the creature. She appeared almost human, at passing glance, but moved and acted like a wild animal. Gaze into her eyes, and all you'd see was a feral beast staring back at you. This I found to be unsettling. I wondered, too, how the Scot felt safe sharing his cabin with her. But alas, men have done far stranger things for the promise of wealth. On the final night before Libsyn, the she-thing even managed to bite my hand as I was offering her a fish. An accident is what I believe it to be, mayhaps. I should have paid more mind when delivering a hungry animal its meal. Nevertheless, her teeth had broken the skin and drawn blood, enough that I needed to bandage myself. Happy to oblige I was when Anthony dismissed me from my quarters for the evening following that encounter. By the time we docked in the port of Libsyn the next day, our rations had run bone dry. The cap sent only his most trusted men out for supplies and ordered the rest of us to stay on board. He feared that turning us loose in the city might have led to some unwanted queries from locals about the special cargo we had hauled. When sailors reach dock, sailors tend to drink. Now, a boozed-up sailor can still be of use to a captain in a lot of ways, but keeping a secret ain't one of them. All this was for the best, as I was not wanting to take any extra responsibilities the day anyhow. From the moment I had awoken that morning, my joints had ached terribly, and my head had felt misty and muddled. Anthony had locked the girl away inside his room while he was out leading the captain's chosen few through Libsyn. I, along with most of the crew, stayed on the ship and waited for he and the rest of the men to return with provisions so we could be on our way. Without the freedom to leave the boat, there wasn't much to do except drink myself to sleep and hope my joint pain passed. So that's exactly what I aimed to accomplish that afternoon. I was taking a cat nap in my hammock when I felt a cold, clammy hand wrapped around my forearms. The sensation shocked me something fierce, but a sudden feeling of dread kept me from opening my eyes right away. Well, you see, I was sure as birth and death it was the fish girl that had snagged me. With Anthony out acquiring rations and groggy mind, reasoned that she had come to me looking for a meal. After all, it had been I alone who assisted the first mate during his grisly suppers. Those icy fingers were gripping me tight, and the damp hand had me certain I was about to wake and find her standing over me, grinning down with that mouthful of daggers, and staring through me with those blood-red eyes. When I finally mustered the courage to look, I saw that it was Job who had stirred me back to the waking world. I stood up in my hammock and readied myself to crack him with the back of my hand for rousing me from my nap. There weren't a lot of men on the boat that I would strike, but Job was the lowest in the pecking order, and a known thief at that, so I had no qualms with belting the old bastard, especially after catching him sneaking around the berth when he should have been topside scrubbing the ship's head. To top it off, the pain in my joints was throbbing worse than ever, and I had attributed that to my sudden awakening. But the look of distress on his face gave me pause long enough for him to speak, and I lost the urge to strike him once he opened his yellow-toothed mouth. "You needn't be upset about me raising you from your slumber," he said. Even the sound of his whispering grinded awful-like inside my ears. "I came to talk to you about that monster we pulled from the drink a few days back. That thing that's got our first mate wrapped round her scaly finger, and our captain fantasizing about treasure that may or may not be real. There be not something altogether right about that journey we embarking on. To me, it stinks to hell and back. Last eve I hid behind the Scots door and listened to the thing that he was saying to the creature. Well, he weren't talking of no jewels or kingdom, I tell you that. I can't say for sure, 'cause I could not understand the monster's tongue, but his words, they sounded treacherous. She put a spell on him, I be thinking. One that somehow gives her the key to his mind. Mayhaps her power lies in that fact that she be eating little bits of him nightly. I watched you help him feed her, and that's the only reason I can fathom why he coddled with such a beast in the first place. Witchcraft it is. Now, I'd be thinking that he and she may be leading us to our deaths. We must be wary, you and I, for to blindly trust a soulless creature such as she is as mad as taking the devil for his word." I yanked my arm free from his grasp and told him that he was lucky I wasn't the type to rat him out to Anthony about his eavesdropping. He turned to plead with me, but my bleary mind had been made up, and I was in no mood to listen to the ramblings of a dirty old thief. "To hell with you!" he shouted at me. "You're just like the rest of them, then. Just like the captain. So blindly be your greed you can't see the danger right before your eyes. Well, you don't believe me, then I'll prove it to you." Job then stormed from the berth with the fury of a tempest. While I strained to forget the old man's warnings long enough to fall back to sleep, we were putting a lot of trust in Anthony to lead us to the promised land. True it was, the first mate had never given any of us a reason to doubt it. But I wondered then, as I lay in my hammock, if this was cause enough to follow the lead without question. We raised anchor and set off from the dock the next morning. Once the shore had disappeared behind the horizon, the cap called every able-bodied soldier up the deck for a meeting. When I had arrived, I was surprised to see the fish girl standing beside Anthony in the cap. It was the first time she had been topside since we caught her. She was dressed in a garment as to cover up her lady parts. More animal than woman she might have been, but the captain had insisted that keeping her covered was a Christian thing to do, so he made sure to have her garbed in front of the crew. It was the first mate's sleeping shirt she was wearing, and it hung from her thin frame, swallowing up her figure like a young boy sporting his father's coat. "Friends and brothers," the captain sang out, "our stern is to the coast. So there'll be no turning back now. The next time we drop anchor, we'll be doing it by the bay of this fair Sea Queen's kingdom. He waved a hand towards the girl, but she paid him no mind. She was still acting skittish and feral, just the same as she'd been since I first laid eyes on her. Our first mate Anthony, continued the captain, had been communicating with the female. It is he, and only he, who she trusted with the coordinates of her kingdom. So follow his orders, sailors, and we'll all be wealthy men by the week's end. Anthony took a step forward to address the crew. He may not have been the captain, but he had the ship's reverence just the same. Maybe more. Ahoy, fellow sailors! When we set off this vessel 4 days ago, we did so as fishermen and whalers. But when this voyage is over, we'll be running home as men with influence. Men of means. Hear, hear, cheered the crew. In a few days, we'll be reaching our destination, he explained. The entrance to this girl's kingdom lies within a place her people call the Golden Grotto. And when he said that, I saw an eager smile stretch across the captain's face. It's a place plucked straight out from the fables we read as children. A cavern where the water's liquid gold, and the walls are encrusted with diamonds. When we find the Golden Grotto, we'll be so close to the treasure, we'll be able to reach out and touch it. He pulled a piece of paper from his jacket. I've been taking the liberty of drawing us a map based on me conversations with the girl. Now, if you be needing me, don't hesitate to call down to my quarters. I'll be in there with the last discussing the customs and diplomacy of her people. Such things will come in handy upon our first encounter with the royal party. Anthony and the she-thing then departed from the group. Most of us went back to cracking and jollies and laughing about our good fortune after that, but not Job. I spotted him hovering off the back of the crowd, all by his lonesome. He just kept right on staring at the Scot and the girl until they disappeared back down below the ship's deck. Only now do I think I know what he was gaping at. He had spotted something wrong. Her garden, those two. Something I believed that I had spotted as well, but had been too afraid to admit. And now that these events are behind me, I can permit myself to recognize the signs that I had so willfully ignored. It wasn't Anthony that had broken free from the group first, once the meeting had adjourned. It was the girl. He had followed her all the way below deck, and not the other way around. Like a child tailing his mother on an afternoon stroll through the marketplace. Job saw it then, and I see it now. Illness would befall me not long after the meeting. By that very evening I had come down with a sudden fever that set my skin ablaze, sent throbs of pain coursing through my muscles, and left me confined to my hammock. And so I slept, soaked in sweat, as the crew carried on their duties topside without me. It was during my malaise that I had began to experience horrific nightmares. Visions that buried themselves so deep inside my head, they tortured me to this day. I dreamt of a city beneath the ocean, looming up from the seabed like the unholy Mecca of Lucifer. So real these visions seemed throughout the duration of my delirium that I couldn't tell the difference between reality on board the ship and the fabrication of my ailing mind. There were castles built of black, jagged coral, so razor-sharp the barbs and spines jutting from their immense bastions would rip a man's skin upon contact. Spires standing hundreds of feet high, erected from the bones of sea creatures more massive than any whale, were scattered about the place. Each underwater structure was enormous and intricately decorated, adorned with thousands of seashells, or draped in colossal curtains of kelp. I had no body during these bizarre fever dreams. Instead, I moved about the sunken city like an ethereal specter. In the center of the district was a church with pointed steeples. Its walls were sculpted from one large piece of smooth, black rock extending upwards from the earth, its roof a dark sea-green mass of repulsive projections, wriggled as if it consisted of millions of monstrous worms. At first I thought it was made of seaweed, and the moving parts were simply a product of the ocean's influence. But as I ventured closer to the wicked house of worship, I found this not to be the case. Nay, I fear the truth is far more unsettling. For to my dismay, I discovered that the thing draped over the top of the church was in fact alive and conscious. It was like no creature I'd seen before, at sea or on land. It had no head or tail, and I could not for the life of me tell you where the beast ended or began, but it writhed about and moaned loud and deep, as though it were suffering and horrible. The moving bits were tentacles of some kind, the tips of which were flat and white, each as long as a full-grown man. An enormous green slug covered with feelers is how I'd describe the unfortunate thing. Foolish it may sound, but I couldn't help but feel sorry for the monstrosity. To my eyes, it seemed as though the slug were a prisoner of that church. The unhallowed cathedral steeps rose up through the beast's flesh, skewering it alive so that it could not swim away. Closer to the terrible place I journeyed. Unable to stop myself, I realized that I was not in control of my actions. A chanting arose from the black church, drowning out even the cries of its monstrous captive. The voices were not human. They sounded of singing dolphins, but unlike the girl, there was some semblance of language in their words, albeit ones I could not understand. Through the doors I traveled ever nearer to the chants, and there I witnessed horrors that could warp a sane man's mind. The underside of the slug thing above the church was now visible. The creature had no eyes or ears, or at least none that I could recognize, but its enormous oval maw, large enough to swallow a merchant ship whole, spanned half its body. Every one of its teeth was as big as a baby humpback and as sharp as the devil's tongue. Columns arranged in a circle ascended up, piercing the creature's pink, spongy belly so as to pin it in place. The interior walls were carved in runes, the likes of which I'm certain no man has seen since before the time of Christ. There were no pews inside the structure, and aside from the pulpit and the column, the chamber was completely bare. But I was not alone inside the church. There were hooded figures in black robes as well. They floated between the pillars in the center of the room, and I knew then that they were the origin of the strange chants I'd been following. The shrouded beings were busy performing their depraved religious rituals and did not acknowledge my presence. So I watched in silence as they worshipped and sang their ominous incantations. In response, the immense slug above cried and moaned throughout the strange ceremony, but never did the dark monks react to its bellowing. When the chanting came to an end, all but one of the worshippers removed their robes and dropped them to the floor. They were males, the same race as the fish girl, and bore the same sharp teeth and webbed fingers as she. Colorful scales even speckled their bodies in a similar fashion. They formed a circle around the one figure still cloaked and lowered their heads in what I assumed to be a prayer. The monk was bigger than the lot of them, at least twice as large. I wouldn't have noticed till the others removed their garments, but now the size difference was palpable. It was their leader, the archbishop of their ungodly congregation. It turned to face me, and I realized that I wasn't as invisible to these things as I had thought. From the sleeves of the high priest's robes emerged a gigantic webbed hand, though they were unlike those of the mer people surrounding it. More monstrous in appearance were these, with grayish-green skin and talons in place of nails. On its wrist it wore a golden bracelet of a strange unearthly design. Mesmerizing I found it to be, both stunning and frightening at the same time, unique to any piece of jewelry I'd ever seen in my life. I feared with all of my soul to look upon the face of the horrible thing, but as I said before, my actions were not my own to control. The thing then raised its claw and removed its cowl, revealing its awful features to me. There would be no mistaking the priest for human as one might. The girl or the other worshippers of that sinful underwater temple, nay, this creature was no more man than the beast imprisoned on the church's roof. Its head was a swollen, misshapen mass of blue-gray scales, and I'm not ashamed to say that I still shudder when I think of it. A dark green fin ran down the middle of its skull, disappearing into its robe. I found myself somehow grateful that it was still wrapped in its ceremonial garments, because the sight of its naked, bloated body may have been enough to break my psyche. Nevertheless, so hideous was the priest's face, froggish and fish-like in appearance, that I'm sure even the most courageous men would scream aloud if they were to lay their eyes on it. A series of gills flapped on the side of the creature's neck, and tusks extended from between its flabby gray lips. Its glassy eyes, yellow and unblinking, sat too far apart on its face, protruding outward like a pair of rotten cabbages as they studied me. Without doubt, the unhallowed congregation was the most appalling vision I'd ever seen. I attempted to scream, but alas, I could not, though the slug expressed enough displeasure for the two of us. It started to thrash above our heads and cry at a deafening pitch. The other worshippers then started up their dolphin chants again, but this only seemed to trouble the sea monster more. It shook the foundation of the building, yet even that did little to cause the priest to break its awful stare from me. My mind was swirling with the horrid sights and sounds occurring inside the submerged church, but just as I started to believe that they would drive me mad, my vision began to darken, and the blare of the creature's screams faded away to nothingness. When my sight had returned, I was again lying in my hammock on the ship. I had my body back, and no longer did my skin burn to the touch. For the first time since Lipson, the fog that had settled inside my mind had started to disperse. My fever had recessed, and with it the visions of that wicked temple and the city beneath the sea. Though the images I bore witness to managed to stay with me, as I could still recall those terrible dreams whenever I closed my eyes.